Shabbat Sholom, everyone. Before I begin this morning, just a disclaimer. I really have a severe cold, and I keep hearing my voice inside my head. It is one of those incredible things with science. It's like I have a stereo system inside my body. So hopefully everything that I say will make sense. If not, please forgive me. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks. Some of the remarks that I have for this morning actually was intending to say last week, but doing Re's bar mitzvah, I had no voice. I literally couldn't speak. So at least my voice is back, and I'm going to take us back a couple of weeks. I know that the majority of us are eager to listen and to understand what really happened this Wednesday in Washington, D.C. with Netanyahu's speech before the joint sessions of Congress. But I want to start a week before that, and I want to tell you something that happened to me and Liz, an experience that we had that really was one of those experiences that you were not planning for in your life, that just came along and really was life-altering in many ways. We were in Argentina visiting Daniela, who's been there for most of the last year. She's finally coming back in a couple of weeks. And Daniela now has a boyfriend in Argentina. That's why we went. We wanted to make sure he was more or less normal. And turns out he's a very nice guy, I must say. And not only is he a nice guy, but his family is super nice. They're all very normal. I mean, to my standards, which is not much to say, but they're very nice people. So Daniela's boyfriend's name is Mati, and Mati's grandfather works tirelessly for the Jewish community in Argentina. He's on the board of his synagogue, and he sounds like one of my board members. He tells me, I'm the only one in my board that works. Nobody else does anything. Very, very nice guy. Sweetheart, really. And he invited us to the commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the AMIA, which is a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. Actually, more than a Jewish community center, is the central address for the Jewish community. It used to be an 8-story building where hundreds of people used to work every day. And in 1994, the 18th of July, 1994, at 9:53 in the morning precisely, a bomb completely demolished the building and killed 85 people. Now, 30 years have passed, and for us who do not live in Argentina, by the way, Argentina is really on the other side of the world, right? It's like a world apart from ours. And for all of us who are not familiar with the story of what happened back then, in 1992, a bomb exploded at the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. And the only thing that's left of the embassy today is a crater. They didn't rebuild the embassy on purpose. They made a park out of it with the number of trees planted in the park corresponding to the number of people who died in the blast of the embassy. Now, back in 1992, we already knew that the responsible party for blowing up the embassy of Israel in Buenos Aires was Iran. And nothing happened. Nobody was prosecuted, nobody was arrested, nobody was brought to justice. Israel took justice on its own the way it could, but nothing really officially happened. And 2 years later, in the middle of the morning, in a thriving city that looks a lot like Paris, this bomb goes off, and 30 years later, not a single one of the perpetrators, of the responsible parties, of the financiers has been brought to justice. As a matter of fact, the few times that we've had a couple of names of people who were guilty of this crime, and we've given the names to Interpol, these people traveled to countries like China, Qatar, Russia with impunity, which is not a surprise to us who live on this side of the world. But we have to understand one thing. What happened there on the other side of the world is not detached from the speech of Prime Minister Netanyahu at the joint session of Congress last week here in the United States, 30 years later. 30 years later, 70 years later, we're fighting the same enemy. Different names, different proxies, but it's still the same enemy. Now, we have been very lucky that only a couple of times this type of bomb has gone off. This, by the way, in Buenos Aires was the largest bombing of a Jewish target outside of Israel in the history of the Jewish people. If you really think about it, no one is exempt, no Jewish community anywhere in the world, from this happening. And for all of us who have been around in the last months here in the United States, and we've seen the protests, and if you were in Washington, D.C. last Wednesday, and you saw those protesters, you know that that can also happen here. And that it's very important we take it seriously, and that we do not say that only happens on the other side of the world. By the way, because of Mati's grandfather, Lisa and I were able to stand literally 5 people away from the president of Argentina. We were really right there at the center of the commemoration. And we were crying our eyes out. Because the only thing they did, by the way, they didn't allow any politicians to speak. Only family of the people who were killed spoke. And when they told the stories, you could put any one of your family members, of my family members, in their own stories. Because aside from the staff that perished that morning, back in 1994 in July, many of the people who were at that building that morning were there just by chance. Some of the people were just walking on the street. And it was really so sad that 30 years later, nothing has been done about it. Let's fast forward a little bit. While I was on my way back from Argentina with Liz, I got a message from Senator Cortez Masto's office, our Nevada senator, asking me if I would like to attend the joint session of Congress to listen to the Prime Minister. And I, of course, said yes. I already had the cold, but I said, look, I have to go because I know that there's a bunch of other rabbis that are boycotting the speech. And I think that, they're boycotting, they're going to be protesting with the protesters, they're going to write things in the newspapers because they don't like Netanyahu. And I understand, right? I am not a fan either. But when the Prime Minister of Israel speaks to a joint session of Congress, we as a people do not have the luxury of participating in any sort of boycotts against the state of Israel, especially after October 7th, which was the whole point of his being here. It's such an important thing to understand. And that's why I went, even with the cold, even I was passing out on the plane. I didn't even know if Delta was taking off, right? The plane, there was no Wi-Fi, there was no entertainment, the flight attendants couldn't work the system. It was really, if you've never flown on a complete meltdown of systems, this is quite scary. But we got to Washington, and I have to tell you that being in this joint session of Congress, being in there, was one of the highlights of my life. This is the 3rd time that I get to listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu at a joint session of Congress. This was by far the most powerful speech I've ever heard because of the context, because of what happened. And it was also incredible, and I counted. We raised up 50 times to give him a standing ovation. Nothing that he said, by the way, was controversial. Nothing that he said was political from his side of the aisle. Everything he said, in my opinion, was said from the perspective of the Jewish people. You know, if we don't take this seriously and we don't stand together, we will not survive this. I'll tell you my favorite vignette that has happened to me since October 7th, by far. On October 7th, right here on the Bima, one of our members, and I think I've told you this one before, came up and gave me an envelope. When I saw what was on the envelope, I called him up and I said, "Are you sure?" He said to me, "Rabbi, this is not a rehearsal. This is for real. They're coming for us." Having been there in Buenos Aires, understanding what happened 30 years ago, and that 30 years later, we have been unable to stop them. We need to understand this is not a rehearsal. And what I'm saying to you today, It's not trying to install fear or trying to be, like an alarm ringer or something like that. I just want us to understand this is serious business. The Torah portion that we read this morning, in contrast to what we read last week, is incredible. Last week, you all know the story of Balaam, the sorcerer that tried to curse us, and every time he tried to curse us, a blessing came out of his mouth. He tried to curse us to death, and he said, "Ma tovu alecha Yaakov." Right? How beautiful are your dwellings, O Israel. And the message there was that whoever tries to curse us, God will put blessings in their mouths. Whoever tried to kill us, God will stop them. But the message this morning with Pinchas is completely different. It seems like it's black and white, day and night. With Pinchas, the message is, if you don't defend yourself, you're on your own. You, Pinchas, take that stick and impale those two people. That's what he felt inside of him. He was following the orders of God. He was defending his people. And for that, by the way, God gives him a covenant of peace, which we understand in a way that the only time that we will get peace is when we are able to take care of ourselves by ourselves. One of the things that was very interesting to me as I was in the Chamber of Congress last week is a different type of people that were in there with me. There were Jews, non-Jews, other rabbis. There were a lot of Orthodox rabbis, a lot of conservative rabbis, a lot of Reformed rabbis. It was really uplifting to see the segments of our community that were represented there. But about 6 or 7 meters from me was Noah Argamani, one of the hostages that was rescued a couple of months ago in Gaza. And looking at her was kind of like an unreal moment in my life. Because for months, I had been looking at that clip of video where she was taken away in that motorcycle. And then we saw the rescue. And then we see her there. And she was severely criticized in Israel for joining the delegation of the Prime Minister to go to Washington. Israelis were telling her, he's using you, don't go. And she was there. And I have so much respect for her. Because being there as a symbol of something that really happened, that saying, I am here, I am real, I was kidnapped, was one of the most important visuals that you could imagine at that moment in time. Look, most of the things that happened within that session of Congress, you could say is part theater, part reality, right? Because everything's choreographed, people get up, they clap, you know who's not going to get up, you know that Rashida Tlaib is going to be sitting there with her little sign. But for the most part, it was a moment that history will judge in the future, I believe, with tremendous trepidation. I don't think that the words of the Prime Minister fell on deaf ears, and I hope that the people who were in there really listened to what he had to say. At the core of our problem, dear friends, is Iran. And if we don't do something about it, they will. And it's a huge issue. And this is not a Republican or Democratic issue. This is an issue that the world as a whole needs to face. They are the sponsors of death and atrocities beyond belief. When I heard the testimonies in Argentina, and by the way, I'll tell you lastly why Luis, Matty's grandfather, is so involved in this commemoration. He used to work 5 blocks away from the AMIA. So the day when the explosion happened, he heard the explosion and ran to the street and was one of the first people to get there. This gentle, wonderful, sweet Zaide, right? And he was there, lifting up the rubble, picking up the bodies, looking at the body parts, trying to put them together with the body they belong to. So the respect that goes to him for doing that is beyond what you can understand. So every year he's invited. One of the families of the victim said he talked about his sister. His sister went there because there was a job bank at the AMIA. People went there looking for jobs. And she was looking for a job, and she went there, and she was so happy. She was restarting her life. She had decided she was going to get a new job and start again. And 5 days later, the only way this young man could recognize her was because of the ring she was wearing. This is what Iran does to our people. And if we can't understand it, and if we don't defend ourselves, nobody else will. So I don't want to be the downer, right? But it's important to understand. Pinchas ben Eleazar ben Aaron HaKohen, right? This figure in the Torah, who takes it upon his own to defend his people. Perhaps he was not wrong. The rabbis do not judge him kindly because he was violent, and we do not like violence. But trust me, it's always easier to be a victim. Being a victim doesn't require any responsibility. When you can exercise power and you are responsible for what you do and your actions, that's a whole different ballgame. And if you ever ask yourselves why so many of our children protest against us and speak against us and lash out against us, it's because being a victim is so much ingrained in their DNA that they cannot get out of that mentality. It's important that we don't fall into that trap ourselves. Shabbat Shalom u'mevorach. Let us please rise.